My name is Damodaran and I am the Chairman of Excellence Enablers. It's my privilege to welcome you to this series of conversations with persons who have batted for us and continue to bat for us within and outside boardrooms and in pursuit of objectives that are important to the nation and to society. They are the evangelists who raise the bar in terms of seeking to attain what is best for humankind. And in the course of these conversations, we will discover, hopefully, some of what we don't know about them, because we know them, we know of them, but maybe there is even more. These are multifaceted personalities. And to get started, let me welcome a person who has held very senior executive positions in different continents, in different countries, in India and outside, in many FMCG giants. And after successfully completing her executive roles, has moved to board positions as an independent director. She is on Indian boards, she is on boards overseas, she is a strategic advisor, and she also adds value in everything that she does. Vinita Bali, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, Mr. Damodaran, and for that very generous introduction.
Thank you. You fully deserve it. Let's get started with something that you and I share, which is a concern that corporate India must do much better than it is to safeguard the interest of stakeholders. Maybe we've moved a long way from where we were, but the recognition must exist that we have a long way to go. Now, you have served on boards in India, you continue to serve on boards in India. You've served on boards outside India, and even in your executive role, you've interacted with boards in a very big way. What are the takeaways that we have from boards overseas? What are the positives?
Thank you for that excellent question to start this conversation with. I've thought about this a lot, and where I end up is that in many ways it is not about India versus overseas. I think where I have seen boards work effectively, I can talk about some of those characteristics. One is that in all those instances, I find that the chairperson is providing adequate leadership for the functioning of that board quite effectively. The second thing I have found is that individuals get included on boards, not because they are known to this one or that one, but because of their track record, because of what the board is seeking to add in terms of diversity or dimensionality to the board, and also because the entire recruitment process of getting on as an independent director on these boards is, you're interviewed like you're interviewed for an executive position. I think what that does is that everybody knows that they are on the board because of their merit and their track record, and not because of proximity either to the chairperson or to the independent director. I think the third thing that happens is that, of course, there is a regulatory and a legal environment, but I think within that, it is the spirit of that regulation and that legality which the board actually goes by. I find that in India, the belief or the implicit assumption is, if we have to check something, let's create a new rule for it, rather than understanding the underlying cause for what is to be changed, and therefore changing it in a systemic basis rather than on a knee-jerk basis. There is an example, Mr. Damodaran, which you and I have talked about often, and that is that in order to be an independent director, if you haven't been on a board for 10 years, you have to answer an exam. And I'm saying, why are boards even looking at people who don't come with that track record, who don't come with that professionalism? And why do we have to get them to take an exam? Everybody on the board doesn't have to be super financially literate, but the board as a whole must have that diversity of experience, of perspective that is ready and adequate for that board.
You used one word in your response, which interests me. You said the selection process for directors of overseas boards. So as compared to a process in India, not in too many cases, but in some cases certainly, you have a selection event, one phone call, the person at the other end of the phone call says, yes, I'm delighted to join, and it's done and dusted. And before you know it, he or she is on that board, completely unprepared, no domain knowledge, no domain expertise, certainly, perhaps not enough understanding of the company rules. The other question I wanted to ask you is, in terms of the quantity of time, more importantly, the quality of time that non-executive directors have to commit to boardrooms, do you see a difference?
Oh, huge difference. This is one area where I see a huge difference. The involvement and the engagement, and this is not just from one board meeting to another board meeting, that continues in between board meetings. And of course, in the last year and a half, when there are so many more issues to tackle, etc., the demands on board members have actually gone up. And I now begin to realize and appreciate why in the UK as well as in the US, they have this concept of overboarding. Till about a year and a half ago, it was 5 boards globally. Well, they reduced it to 4 boards globally, and it makes enormous sense to me because actually the time I spend on meetings, on preparing for board meetings, on the depth of discussion, on the detail orientation, etc. And this is not doing the executive's role. So don't get me wrong. This is the board doing its role, is very high. And therefore, I think if you have to give quality time to a board, especially to boards which work in domains where you have not operated. I made a conscious decision not to be on the board of another FMCG because I said after 38 years of being in FMCG companies, I want to learn about other domains. But I was also clear about what I could do and what I couldn't do. And that is another reason why the time that is required, again, to be an effective board member is much higher. The demands on your time are much higher, I find, on overseas boards as compared with Indian boards. And that, again, something which we've talked about, also has to do with what gets into the agenda, how the agenda is handled, discussion versus presentation. The role, actually, I believe the chairperson plays in ensuring that the board actually does what the board is supposed to do, which is to lead, to give direction, and not to manage, or worse still, micromanage.
Interesting, you touched on the role of the chairperson, and that leads me to something that I wanted to ask. How important is culture in an organization, and how important is character in the boardroom? You referred to the importance of character in a recent interview of yours. And at the end, you quoted Gandhiji. Of course, every context, Gandhiji has a relevant quote. This one I thought was very appropriate. You talked in terms of how to go about life. But how important is it, the setting, the tone, the conduct, the character, the zero tolerance towards things, not an excessive focus on the bottom line to the exclusion of values and principles? Who does that? How well is that done?
I feel there is nothing more important than setting the right tone, both from a cultural lens as well as, and both are related, as well as, what is going to be the character of this company? Is this a company that is going to, give in to petty demands? Is this a company that is going to stay its ground? And in that context, I think if the board is not setting the cultural norms, and if the board is not setting, those characteristics or those attributes of a company that the board considers to be significant and important, then who's going to do it? If that aspiration and that direction and, that those standards of excellence and ethics are not set by the board, then who is going to set those standards? It's certainly not the regulator. The regulator can regulate, but the regulator cannot set the standards of excellence or the cultural norms that companies are going to live by. And again, here, if you Google any company and you talk about our values and purpose, everybody's talking about integrity, respect for the individual, etc. And then the question becomes, how much of that are we actually seeing in action when you are under stress? As somebody said, if you want to check character, put those individuals under stress. And I'm saying I could extend it to a company and say, when you want to see character, put that company under stress and see what decisions are made for quarterly results and what decisions are made for what is right in the long term, but may not go well with either the shareholders or the market or the analysts in the short term.
I had, after studying the code of conduct of several companies within India and overseas, over the last several years, discovered an interesting phenomenon, which is the longer the code of conduct is, less the chance of its being complied. By way of illustration, Enron had a 64-page code of conduct. Not too many companies have a code of conduct that long, and we know what they did with that code of conduct. But moving away from this to 3 letters of the English alphabet, which everyone is talking about, not all that talk about it understand it. Not all that understand it practice. And I'm talking about ESG, which I know is very close to your heart. You mentioned in a recent article that ESG is important for companies. I want to turn it on its head and say companies are important for ESG. ESG will go nowhere if companies don't get their act together. And I think firstly, the understanding, not treating it as some kind of badge of courage that you haven't earned but still choose to wear by writing English in annual reports. What is the way forward for ESG?
I think this is a very big one, and if we step back and even ask the question as to why is ESG suddenly become very important, I think one of the pointers is that corporations and actually governments, and in governments I include, everything from the politician to the regulator, have obviously not done what they're supposed to do to be in the state in which we are. And I don't have to go through all of that. There is enough empirical evidence, and David Attenborough, who's my hero, has spent 94 years of his life telling the world that this party is not going to last forever, but somehow we don't accept it. There was a wonderful Red Indian saying that I came across one time, and loosely translated, it means that, when all the waters are polluted and the air is polluted and the trees have been cut and the birds have gone, you will realize that you cannot eat money. And I think that is so true. Now, I think companies, part of governance has to be the relationship that companies have with communities, that communities and companies have with their countries, that countries have with each other, because that is the only way for this planet to, to ensure that there is a good quality of life for everybody, not for a select few. And again, we look at things on the periphery rather than understanding deeply, what does E mean? When we talk about the environment, and there are so many dimensions to each of these. S is usually loosely translated as, okay, let's report on board diversity. Let's now look at what is the median pay to top management pay, etc. That is not S. And governance, which is the biggest, is the most confusing, if you ask me. And if you think about governance, and I read somewhere that actually governance, the word, has a very interesting pedigree. It goes back to the time of Chaucer, at which time, it meant responsibility and wisdom. And its Latin word actually means to steer. So I think a lot of work needs to be done on saying what exactly is included in governance. And again, we come back to the same point that if there is character and if there is ethical behavior, I think governance should actually decrease and not increase.
Let me take you to another area where you have been very, very active, which is nutrition. You've been the global ambassador. How bad is the situation?
Terrible. It is terrible. And people understand hunger, but we don't understand nutrition. And, talking about hunger. So, when you are hungry, you're also malnourished. So right now, out of 7.5 billion people in the world, 800 million are chronically hungry, which means they never have enough calories on any day. And about 200 million of those 800 million live in India. The pandemic has further exacerbated those numbers. If, on the other hand, you look at the right balance of macronutrients and micronutrients, which are vitamins and minerals, then out of the 7.5 billion people, about 2.5 to 3 billion people are not getting enough of either the macronutrients or micronutrients or both. And it is the estimate of the World Bank that a country like India loses anywhere up to 1 to 2% of its GDP on account of low productivity, where the underlying cause is undernutrition or malnutrition. So again, this is an area where if the corporate sector doesn't get involved, it's not going to change.
Let me take you to another area very quickly, which is the area of NGOs. And what is it that the NGOs can bring to the corporate world? And what is it that they can take away from the corporate world in terms of how they go about what they do?
Here again, rather than generalizing, let's talk about effective NGOs and effective corporates. One of the things that I have seen over and over again in NGOs is the sheer involvement, commitment, dedication to the cause. Corporates keep talking about purpose. In an NGO, that purpose is written large on everybody's forehead. That purpose is written large in terms of the actions they take. So I think, and also in an NGO, let's not forget, a lot of people are actually volunteering their time. And you can only be a volunteer if you have that josh, if you have that junoon, which says that this is something I believe in, and this is something I'm going to commit my time, my effort, my energy to change. Now, there are ineffective NGOs and there are ineffective organizations. But I think what distinguishes them is that clarity of purpose, that clarity of what needs to change, that clarity of how we can make lives better. And there are no two ways about it. I think corporates sometimes get too confused and distracted with what they believe are multiple objectives, which actually they are not, because if we spent the time and went through them, all of those objectives are actually related to each other. And ESG is going to force corporates to look at things as a connection and not as disparate pieces. So I do believe that it is about clarity, it is about purpose, and it is therefore then about excellence and giving of your best.
Let me briefly touch on two things, and I'll leave it open-ended because I want to hear what you have to say. One is your interest in the performing arts, and the other is your interest in the sports field. It's an interesting combination that one is indoors, the other is outdoors, but I suppose there must be commonalities that drove you to both these areas. So tell us about it. What is this interest about, and are these areas where you can contribute?
Fabulous.
Help India win the next gold medal. Yeah.
You know, I wish. So right now, what a great time to talk about sports. You know, and we've seen so many of the world's greats. Yesterday, the record that Elaine Thompson created in the 100 meters, or you know, when you think about somebody like Florence Griffith, who was again a wonderful runner, 200 meters, etc., etc., and of course the all-time greats like Carl Lewis and Jesse Owens, etc. And I look at these sports people, and then I look at wonderful musicians, dancers, artists, you know, from Alauddin Khanji in India to you know, a Maria Callas, and you know, so many people who wrote wonderful symphonies, etc., that we still you know, enjoy listening to. I think the one thread I find common is what I would call the pursuit of excellence. And it is this pursuit of excellence that wakes me up every morning at 4 o'clock if I'm an athlete to go and practice and rehearse. It is that same pursuit of excellence that causes me to spend 11 years with Baba Alauddin Khan learning one rag, you know, which was true of people like Ali Akbar Khan and Ravi Shankarji and Nikhil Banerjee and so many of his students. Because if you can master one rag, if you can really master it, then everything else becomes simple. That search for excellence, that pursuit of excellence, it's not perfection, because, you know, perfection to my mind is a goal or an end point. It is a moving target. You know, how do sports people better past records? And, you know, those records have been bettered. It could be over a period of many years, but that's what it is. And I think that is the human spirit which each of us has. And if we could just spark that same human spirit, that level of intelligence and excellence in the corporate world, can you imagine what we could achieve, Mr. Damodaran?
Thank you for those insights. You know, in the course of under half an hour, I think my takeaways have been very large, even though I have known you for years now. And yet in this conversation, there are aspects that I got to know about. And I hope several others that will see this program get to know about, get to imbibe, get to practice. Because the pursuit of excellence, that journey is something that I think sets the performers apart from the non-performers. And we need to see more performers in every which stage of the world. Thank you very much for being a part of this conversation.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity and for your wonderful questions. Really enjoyed it as always. Thank you.